This Choircast podcast is brought to you by the book Used to Go to Church, Rethinking God on the Front Line of Life's Tragedies by Nick Felicities. As a first responder chaplain for over 23 years, Nick blends firsthand accounts of tragedy with opportunity for raw self-examination and reflection. For the spiritual but not religious who want to pursue God outside of the walls of organized religion, Used to Go to Church is an invitation to rethink faith and open up to a life centered on grace, mercy, and love. Find it today on Amazon.
Welcome to the Unbelief Podcast, your journey, actually our journey together beyond inherited beliefs to a spirituality that works for you. I'm your host, Jeremy. I'm a deep skeptic, also a pastor. We can fix that later, right? No?
You've reached another book club episode of the Unbelief Podcast. We are continuing now in our looking at a story where everything seems to unravel and spiral out of control in this nation. And it gets worse and worse and worse until this moment that things change. Corner is pivoted, corner is turned, and it feels like something better is on the way. And today we're going to get to the turning of the corner, the supposed turning of the corner. And we've gone through these plagues, the first half of the plagues. And today we're looking at Exodus chapter 9. And in chapter 9, it just gets worse. So it says, it starts in chapter 9. It says, the Lord says to Moses, go to Pharaoh, say to him, let my people go. And that happens. And God says, tell him that things are going to get worse. There's going to be a disease that affects the livestock, the horses, the donkeys, the camels. And again, like in the previous plague, it says that God protects God's people, the area of Goshen where the Israelites are living. Those animals will not be affected. And so that's what happens. A huge plague comes over, and all of the Egyptians' livestock died, and not one of the Israelites' livestock suffers from a pestilence. Now, in this story, a historical Moses is difficult to come up with. And so really taking this story super literally and worrying about how does every livestock die in one area versus another, not super helpful. And it sort of eventually, it gets you to the place where you start missing the point, right? Oftentimes that's what taking the Bible literally does. You focus on dealing with how to reconcile the literal text, reconcile this actually happening, or find a historical correlation in some sort of, in this case, it would be hieroglyphic records of the pharaohs. And instead of actually focusing on the meaning, instead of focusing on like where I can connect to this and how this can help me live my life, help me become the best version of myself, experience transcendence, whatever it is, we get stuck in the literalism. That's what can happen here. But we're not going to do that. We're going to rise above the temptation to get bogged down in the literal details. It happens. This plague of the livestock happens. That's the fifth plague. And then we go to the sixth plague, like right after it, right on the heels. It says, okay, Moses and Aaron, we're not going to give Pharaoh another option. We're going straight into the next thing. And Moses takes handfuls of soot from the kiln, throws it in the air in the sight of Pharaoh, and everybody in Egypt, but not the Jewish people, they will all have boils on their skin, and the animals will also have boils on their skin. And that happens. And so throughout this whole process, Pharaoh has, these magicians that can do the same kinds of things. And the magicians come back into the story here. It says that the magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils, because the boils had afflicted the magicians as well as the Egyptians. Yeah. So the magicians are now sidelined. Sixth plague. It is way more than they can handle. And this is important because the magicians have sort of done slightly different or slightly less versions of whatever the plague has been, right? Or whatever the sign has been. And that has caused, obviously, Pharaoh to say, well, it's all the same, right? You're doing something, they can do the same thing. I'm not impressed. And that can happen in our lives, right? It can happen that there is someone that is doing something, that is saying something to us that is powerful, that if we paid attention to it, it would really pull us in. It would take us into a new and a better place. But new and better places, further into our lives, all of that kind of stuff means change. It often means discomfort, right? If Pharaoh is to give in to this, like losing all of these slaves, this would be upend everything. When we get in those moments where somebody is really pulling at us to go in a new direction, to go deeper, to whatever it is, even if it's good long-term for us, even if it's exactly what we need to do, it's gonna mean change. And change can be really uncomfortable. Change, even the thought of change can make us anxious and not want to do that. And so as that person is doing it, sometimes what we have, not necessarily magicians, but the magicians in our head, right? Saying, oh, you know what? They said this. It's similar to what you were doing already, right? You don't need to change. You don't need to go in a different direction. You don't need to stand up for this issue. You kind of are already doing it, right? You did make a post on social media about it. Yeah. And these magicians in our head or some people that are sort of trying to keep us where we are, we want to believe them, and it's easy to believe them because they're telling us the thing that we want to hear, the thing that means there won't be change. And then we come to a place sometimes, hopefully, where the sound of the magicians' voices just get lower and lower, and the magicians can't hold sway over our decisions anymore, over our perception anymore, and they get lost. They get lost in the midst of this calling to us for change, to do something new and better and different, to stand up for something that is right. Yeah. I wonder right now for you, what are the magicians saying? What is the sleight of hand that is sort of mimicking this thing that you know you need to do, this thing that you know you need to say? What are the magicians doing to distract you from that? And then we get to the seventh plague. We're still in chapter 9, but this is like 2/3 of chapter 9. So now Pharaoh is going to get another chance, another explicit out. God tells Moses, get up early, go to the Pharaoh and say, let my people go again, right? We're going to give Pharaoh this option again because I'm going to send my plagues upon you so that you may know there is not one like me in earth. And so Moses is going to threaten him and say, look, things are going to get bad. And he tells him what's going to happen. Tomorrow, hail will fall that has unlike anything that's ever fallen in Egypt. And he warns him. He says, okay, look, get all your livestock, everything you have in the open field, take it to a secure place. And because every human, every animal in the open field, it's going to die when this hail falls. And it says here, now this is interesting, in verse 20, those officials of Pharaoh who feared the word of the Lord hurried their slaves and livestock off to a secure place. But those who did not regard the word of the Lord left their slaves and livestock in the open field. So what you see here, there's a turning, right? There are officials of Pharaoh who have realized Pharaoh is wrong. And maybe Pharaoh is not going to do it, but they've watched Moses 6 times in a row say, this thing is going to happen. Watch out. Let God's people go. And though Pharaoh doesn't respond, what Moses says happens is going to happen, actually happens. And this is the moment where you start seeing the cracks forming. There are officials of Pharaoh who are now believing Moses. And you've got to imagine in the back rooms, they're saying to Pharaoh, hey, dude, like, this is happening over. Like, you are putting our country at risk. Just stop it. And so it happens. Moses stretches out his hand, and the Lord sends thunder and hail, and fire comes down on the earth. I mean, it is bad, except, again, in this one area where the Israelites live in Goshen. And as has happened a couple times before, it's so bad that Pharaoh actually brings Moses and Aaron and says, like, this time, and this, he has not said this, but he recognizes his fault. And he says, this time I have sinned. The Lord is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Pray to the Lord. Enough of God's thunder and hail. I will let you go. You need stay no longer. It looks like it's worked. It looks like Pharaoh has figured it out. I mean, at this point, Pharaoh is recognizing that Pharaoh has sinned, that his people, right? His people are in the wrong. And this is a huge moment. This is big, expansive language. Pharaoh isn't just saying, please make it stop. Pharaoh is saying, this is my fault. Which, when you think about it, when you think about the cracks forming with the other officials, right? It makes sense. You've got to imagine the officials are coming up to Pharaoh, his cabinet, right? Saying, all right, you've got to, this is your fault. You keep making the wrong decision. Stop it. Make this stop. And so he does. He confesses. He says, I'm going to let the people go. And so Moses says, look, okay, I will go out and I will stretch out my hands and it's going to cease. And then in verse 30, Moses says, but as for you and your officials, I know that you do not yet fear the Lord God. Yeah. Moses isn't an idiot. Like, Moses sees what's happening, And he sees that like every time that Pharaoh brings him back in and like begs for mercy, it's getting more and more as if Pharaoh is really getting it. But Moses says, no. I can see it. You're making these claims. And I know, I'm sure in the moment you were just trying to beg for your life. But this isn't real. You're just saying the things that you know you're supposed to say to make it happen, make it stop. But Moses does what he says he's going to do. He stretches out his hands, and the thunder and the hail ceased. The rain no longer poured down on the earth. Then in verse 34, we find that Moses was right. This is when Pharaoh saw that the rain and hail and thunder had ceased, he sinned once more and hardened his heart. He and his officials, and he doesn't let them go. Just as Moses had called. And so we have this moment that I feel like it's a human moment, right? We hear stories. I think most of us have a story where in the midst of something really hard, we just cry out to God. God, if you will just XYZ, I will be faithful forever. If you would just heal me, if you would just help me get out of this horrible job, if you would just whatever, I will do whatever I will be a good person. I will stop whatever the sin is that you were agreeing to. And then things get better and we forget the promise we made to God. We forget that we said we're going to do, and maybe we start down that path where we're like, no, it just fades into the distance because in that moment of desperation, our heart hasn't changed. Like who we are hasn't changed. Our actual will and desire to do something different, that hasn't changed. We are just desperate and trying to make anything happen differently. And so we pull the God ripcord and say, God, get me out of this, please. I will believe in you. I will whatever. But it's not honest. It's not authentic. It's just desperation. And I think what's kind of beautiful here is that Moses and God know that Pharaoh's heart hasn't changed. But Pharaoh gets mercy anyway. Right? The thing that Pharaoh is begging for actually happens. And that's what mercy is. Mercy is unmerited favor, unmerited kindness. Mercy is somebody in a horrible place, a place of their own making, and then, even though they don't deserve it, somebody steps in and makes it stop. Yeah, that's what happens here. And that idea of mercy is something that happens over and over in the Bible. It's something that this spiritual text and many other spiritual texts want to say to us about God, that God, even though we don't deserve it, God will have mercy on us. God will help us. And And part of the reason that happens is because God is wanting us to be merciful to other people. Yeah. So we've got another plague, right? Pharaoh hardens, the people are not let go. The people are still there. It says, then the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart of his officials, in order that I may show my signs among them. And I'm going to make fools of them. And so Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh and say, look, if you don't, tomorrow, there's going to be locusts in your country. And no one's going to be able to even see the land. They're going to devour everything that was left, right? The hail destroyed all kinds of crops. And now, if you don't let the people go, the locusts are going to come and everything is going to be gone. So Pharaoh's officials say to him, how long is this person going to be a snare to us? Send the people away. So now we hear, okay, the officials are like, oh my gosh, Pharaoh, you've got to stop this. And it seems to work, right? Pharaoh actually brings Moses and Aaron back in. He says, okay, look, go serve God. But which ones? Which ones of you are going to go? And Moses said, we're going to go with everybody. Old and young, sons and daughters, right? Flocks, herds, because we have the Lord's festival to celebrate. And then Pharaoh says, no. If I let everybody go, you're never going to come back. And so no. I mean, you can take your men, but that's it. And it says they were driven out of Pharaoh's presence, and that's it. God says, no, do it. And Moses stretched out his staff, and the locusts come. Everything happens just as Moses had said. And again, Pharaoh brings Moses, says, I've sinned against the Lord, your God, and you do forgive my sin this once, and pray to God that at the least you'll remove this deadly thing. So he goes, the Lord has everything change. The locusts leave, but he doesn't let the Israelites go. And so Pharaoh doesn't get another chance. This one is right on the heels, right? Stretch out your hand, verse 21 of chapter 10. Stretch out your hand toward heaven so that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt. And here's the like really intense, a darkness that can be felt. Whew. Have you ever sensed that? In the next verse, it actually calls it a dense darkness. Yeah, a dense darkness. It says people can't see each other. It lasts for 3 days. A dense darkness. And this dense darkness, oh my gosh, one scholar says this passage tumbles over itself with urgency and alarm. And so Pharaoh summons Moses and says, go serve the Lord, but your flocks and herds have to remain behind. Even your kids can go with you. But here's the thing. Moses, this whole point is for them to go out and observe a festival, to worship God. And in that region of the world, in this, the way they worship is they worship by animal sacrifices. And I know that is not something we want to think about in the modern world. It seems very just backwards and horrible and cruel. But we can't put our modern values onto these ancient texts. This is the way it was. And so Moses is like, what are you talking about? We can't worship without animals. And Pharaoh says, no, leave. Don't come back. He says, take care that you don't see my face again, for on the day you see my face, you shall die. And then Moses, this is hard. He's like, sorry, great. Just as you say, I'll never see your face again. So we are coming to the last plague. And the last plague is horrifying. It is genocide. It is the death of an entire generation, the death of an enormous number of animals. This is called the plague of the firstborn, and what is going to happen. God explains it in chapter 11. Look, I'm going to go throughout the land, and all of the firstborn will die. And as a result, all of the officials of Pharaoh are going to bow down. You're going to get not just to leave, you're going to get to leave with riches and wealth of the people who were your master. This is going to be a way bigger deal than this started out. And at the same time, if you grew up in church, you might be familiar with these plagues, right? You might have remembered the frogs and the lice and the locust and all the stuff. And you probably remember the plague of the firstborn. But it's important to stop here, because this isn't just a plague. This is a horrifying thing that is going to happen. And it is God who is doing it. So what do you do with that? Right? A God who is going to kill an entire generation. Let's be clear. This is not a good look for God. This is the kind of stuff that people who have a problem with the Bible, this is the kind of stuff they have. This idea that God is this horrible, violent, vengeant being. Yeah. And let's just be clear. There's no way to interpret or weasel our way out of the horror of this moment. There's no way. Yeah, there's no way to get out of it. There's no way to make God not be killing all of these people. And it's something we have to be horrified by. To not be horrified by this is to be pretty cold, pretty calloused. To not be horrified by this is to just stick our head in the sand and say, no, it's fine. It's fine. God's doing it. It's fine. It's not fine. It's not okay. And that is where you have to start with this. This is not fine. This is not okay. But this whole story is about God showing God's strength. And so if we went back to the world into which this was being written, the idea was that there were gods, multiple gods. And in fact, even here in this part of the Bible, in these stories, it's assumed there are multiple gods. It's assumed that every country has at least one patron deity. And in the way you know whose God is more powerful is who wins the battles, is who is able to negotiate their way out of whatever it is. And this last plague, A, it's horrible, but B, it is a massive show of strength by the God that is in this story, right? It is a show of strength that cannot be denied, that will make absolutely everything and everyone just want to bow down and not be another victim of this incredibly powerful God that is backing these slaves. And so what this story functions as culturally, this part of the story is just a proof of how strong this God is, and how that means that the God of Israel is stronger than the other gods of the other countries. Yeah. So chapter 12 begins with a really interesting shift in tone, right? What we get here is the part of the story that's actually pointing towards the future, right? The people who are writing this, it's most likely not Moses, or the people who are writing this are way after this. And they are writing in a time where they have been observing this ritual for a long time. And so this is the sort of writing into this and saying, okay, so now we're gonna make this ritual. This is the ritual language, right? This is the beginning of the whole cultic practice amongst these people. It says, this month shall mark for you the beginning of months, shall be the first month of the year, right? This is language not meant to be really about Moses. This is language about the future, right? This is why we start our year with this month. This is why we start our year with this sacrifice, because of this story. And what happens is they sacrifice an animal, they mark their doorways with it, and then God tells them to be ready to go. Right? Because when this happens, there will be so much grief that they will just be able to walk out with all of the blessings that God has already told them they were going to have. And so yeah, right now you got to get your clothes on, get your walking shoes on, get your walking stick, and eat this ceremonial meal quickly. And when you do that, your doorposts, when they're marked, this angel of death will not hit your house. It won't be you, right? And so God gives this ritual for them to do and says that this is going to be, you're going to remember this forever. You're going to pass this story down to your kids and your grandkids, because every year you're going to rehearse this story. You're going to tell the story, and you're going to celebrate the same meal. And so Moses tells them what to do. They do exactly as God commands them. And then things get really horrible. In verse 29 of chapter 12, it says, "At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt." All of them. All of them. And you know, this language, it's beautiful in one sense, because the language of this horrible act, it is simple, straightforward language. The horror of this thing needs no embellishment, but also there's not celebration, there's not happiness in this language, because it's sad. Even if you are among the Israelites who are protected from this, it is still sad. There is no pleasure in death here. There's no pleasure of anyone in this horrible thing that happens. It says Pharaoh gets up in the middle of the night. All of the officials, all the Egyptians. It says there's a loud cry in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. And so it happens. Finally, after this horrific moment, the people go. The people leave. And this is something that we experience, right? There's something that we really want. There's something that needs to happen. It's something that if it happens, things will be better. If it happens, things will improve. When it happens, like, it needs to happen. And then, the worst thing possible occurs. And somehow the good thing that needed to happen, it happens in that moment. In the darkest night, in the midst of all of the horrible things, something that needed to even though it's difficult, even though it's hard, leaving the place where you have lived for generations is hard, right? But in the midst of the darkest moment, something good happens. Yeah. And it's interesting because what happens here, it's not just good. It's actually way better than what would have happened if the first time Moses asked Pharaoh to let God's people go, that if it had happened then. That's some of the real stuff of life, right? In the darkest moment, something good happens. Sometimes it's something that's like, it's way better than you could have imagined. And yet in that moment, you don't see it. I mean, you're relieved. You're glad that something's happening. But things are so hard and so bad that all you can see in that moment is that, okay, this thing has happened that needed to happen. Something is breaking. Something good is beginning to happen. Something good is, we're on a different path. Yeah. A different path that I think is going to lead in a better place. But in the midst of the darkness, all you can do is just take what good comes to you and move ahead with it. And here's something that's really important. Here's something that's really essential to learn in life that the story is telling us in part. Obviously not directly, but this life lesson. Sometimes when it's the worst moment, we just want to only be in the worst moment. Then in that worst moment, when something good presents itself, you feel like you shouldn't even take it. You shouldn't even allow it to happen because no, this horrible thing happened. This horrible thing happened. And because this horrible thing happened, I can't receive anything good, anything positive. I can't accept the good thing that's coming into my life right now because I only need to focus on the bad. That's not it. That's not helpful or healthy. Even in the bad moments, good things can happen. And when you're in the hardness, when you're in the darkness, when you are in that dark place that feels so dark, it's like touchable. Yeah. There's a little glimmer of light. When there's something good that happens, we have to take hold of it. We have to let it come into our lives because, if you look at the story, what it's saying is like, that's God's grace. That's God's gift coming to us in the middle of the darkness. We've got to learn to recognize that as God or the universe or whatever as giving us a gift in the hard time. Yeah. And what happens next is just that. They're leaving. It feels like at this point, we've turned the corner in the story, right? All the let my people go has resulted in the people actually being let go. But as is often the case, what we're going to see is, yes, the people have been let go, but that's not the end. It's not ever that easy. Right? Life, like good stuff happens, but it's not ever as easy as it seems at the beginning. It may be really good. It may be actually going to happen, but then all of a sudden you realize, wait a second. It's not as good, not as easy as we thought. We're going to have to work for it. And that is where we're headed. And we call this a book club episode because we talk about it. We talk about it in our group called Not Church. It's this wonderful community that is full of people that are exploring spiritual things, that are trying to become the best version of themselves, find a purpose greater than themselves. It's like, well, the reason we call it Not Church is because somebody said it's like all the things you wanted from church, except there's nobody telling you you're going to hell because you don't believe the right thing. Yeah. It's not church. If you're interested, I think you would love it, by the way. It's full of people like us, and it's beautiful. We don't ask people who are part of this spiritual community to give us some percentage of their income. No, like we've all been traumatized by that. This is just pay for what you get. It's $3 a month, and $3 a month is if you it's a low bar, and you pay for what you get. If it stops working, you just stop paying. And the way you become part of that community is you go to patreon.com/skepticpastor. That's patreon.com/skepticpastor. You can sign up for there. You can sign up for other tiers as well. And man, It's great. I really hope you'll join us. Also, wherever you're listening to this podcast, it really does help if you give us all the stars, and even more if you actually rate the podcast with words. That is really helpful. You can just say this podcast doesn't suck or whatever. But if you can do that, we'd appreciate it. It really helps.
That's it. That's the podcast. Shout out to the Choir Network, to Patheos, to Matthew and Keith, who make everything happen. Now, get out of here. Go do something to make the world a better place. Okay? We'll see you next time.